Hi, my name is Courtney Shaw, in case you're not familiar with me. Welcome to not Community Conversations. I almost totally went into autopilot on that one. Welcome to the biggest event of the social sciences calendar. This is the VEST lecture, and I am so pleased to welcome you all here. This is our big event, and I would be remiss if I didn't take a moment to thank those who helped make this possible. So first, I want to thank the Social Sciences Department for all the good work they do, helping to put this all together. I also want to thank the Dean of Instruction for providing lovely goodies for us. And of course, to the William Vest Memorial Fund, which helps pay for our events. And that is in honor of William Vest. So Bill came to the college in 1969 as a member of the Social Sciences Department, and for the next 15 years, Bill taught Western civilization and political science, and he was widely respected as a great teacher, a master of his subject. He deeply cared about his students and was also a mentor to his colleagues. Bill's leadership on campus was evidenced by being selected as the department chair of the Social Sciences Department several times during his tenure, and in light of that, I hope to follow adequately in his footsteps, introducing him to all of you. Some of you remember him fondly. Some of us didn't quite have that honor there. After his death in 1984, the Social Sciences Department instituted a lecture series in his memory. And this year, we finally welcome a guest speaker who was invited to speak originally in that long ago time of the spring of 2020. Yes, so that didn't quite happen for reasons, right? Life's funny sometimes, but I'm very pleased that we were able to reschedule a mere 3 years later. So I'm very pleased to introduce Becca Thorpe, who is a political science instructor at the University of Washington, and she studies U.S. institutions and political development with a focus on the emergence and growth of the world's most powerful military complex and expansive prison apparatus. Becca Thorpe's current project examines the history of exclusionary housing, demolition projects, and repressive policing, and connects episodes of state violence to political contestation, armed resistance, and street violence. Please welcome Dr. Rebecca Thorpe.
Wow, well, thank you so much, Courtney, for that generous introduction. How's the mic doing? Can you guys hear me okay in back? Better? Good? All right. Well, thank you again. It's a pleasure to finally be here. As Courtney mentioned, I was invited to come give this lecture in 2020. This has now been delayed for 3 years on account of the pandemic. So this visit is really highly anticipated and a long time coming. And thank you to everyone who came out and spending an evening inside on what turned out to be a really, really beautiful evening. So I'm going to talk to you about my current book project on state violence and resistance and discuss some of the implications for American politics. When we think about state violence, we tend to think about physical violence at the hands of state agents, things like policing and incarceration. And I actually began my book project with this focus in mind. So just for context, the term mass incarceration refers to historically and comparatively extreme rates of imprisonment in the US. So you can see in the figure here that imprisonment rates were, imprisonment rates were historically stable and relatively low, on par with other Western democracies, and have increased 600% since the 1970s. Incarceration rates peaked in 2007 and subsequently declined, but only very modestly. The US is also the largest jailer on Earth. With 5% of the world's population, the US contains 25% of the world's prisoners, including 2.2 million people who are currently imprisoned, either in prison or jail, as well as more than 7 million people on probation or parole. And just for reference, that's about the size of the population in Washington state. Now, researchers have also found that the chances of ending up in prison are heavily biased by both race and class. So if recent trends continue, 1 in 3 black men and 1 in 6 Hispanic men will spend some time in their life in prison or jail. And Michelle Alexander highlighted these racial disparities when she coined the term the new Jim Crow, which refers to mass incarceration as a new system of racial and social control, which replaced slavery in Jim Crow after the Civil Rights Movement. This is a graph from Bruce Western and Becky Pettit, showing the percentage of young men in prison or jail by race and education in 1980 as a baseline comparison, and in 2008. And these scholars really highlight both the racial and class dimensions. So you can see that imprisonment rates have always been relatively low for young men with college of all races. However, imprisonment has become a routine life experience for young men without high school. So in 2008, about 12% of white men, 8% of Latino men, and 35% of black men without high school spent some time behind bars. And the sociologist Loic LaQuant draws on these trends and emphasizes class disparities. So LaQuant argues that prisons affect the most socioeconomically marginal among us, including the mentally ill, the drug addicted, and young, black, poor men and women living in areas of concentrated disadvantage. And he argues that prison has become a system for essentially warehousing people who are locked out of formal labor markets. So people that are either unemployed or unemployable in an increasingly globalized economy. Now, meanwhile, the rise of mass incarceration also coincided with the jobs crisis, right? So since the 1970s, unemployment has been historically high for young men in the South and non-South, both black and white. However, unemployment is 2 times as high for low-skilled black men than for their white counterparts. Now, these narratives may be familiar to some of you. They've recently energized and animated social movements, and they've entered into mainstream national dialogues. However, as I began to research the racial geography of poverty and incarceration, I found that the United States is not only extraordinarily unequal and extraordinarily punishing, but also has extraordinary levels of violence and violent victimization. And that brought me to another, I think, related crisis, which recently made news headlines. So mainstream media outlets like CNN and New York Times recently reported that gun violence was the leading cause of death for children in 2020 in the context of the pandemic. For the first time historically, surpassing vehicle crashes, cancer, and other accidental deaths. And this is a graphic courtesy of the New York Times. David Wallace Wells wrote an op-ed for the New York Times, arguing that it's not deaths of despair, it's deaths of children. And Wallace Wells highlights what he calls an American mortality anomaly. And by that he means that Americans are dying younger than residents of other Western nations, driven in large part by the deaths of children and teenagers. And he cited statistics showing that while COVID accounted for 2% of pediatric and juvenile deaths, firearms accounted for almost half of the increase. From another perspective, though, these figures are actually somewhat misleading. If you disaggregate by race, you can see that white children are much more likely to die of gun suicide than children of other races, and white children are slightly more likely to die of gun accidents. However, black children were 100 times more likely than white children to be shot and killed at the height of the pandemic. And I found that these racial disparities are not new, and rates of violence are actually lower now than they were in previous decades. And fatalities from mass shootings, which are very high-profile, disturbing events, which we're all really familiar with, tend to account for fewer than 4% of gun homicides in a typical year. So in light of all of this evidence, I shifted my research focus, and I questioned why the US experiences such exceptional rates of violence and violent victimization. And if you look historically at US homicide rates, you can see that homicides were relatively stable and on par with other Western democracies until 1966. And then the homicide rate doubled between 1966 and 1970. Violence fluctuated, but was disproportionately high until the mid to late 1990s, then fell pretty sharply and peaked again in 2016 and 2020. Robert Sampson highlights 3 eras of what he calls the violent crime prison nexus. And he shows that from 1960 to 1975, imprisonment rates actually fell very slightly as violent crime increased. In the 1970s and 1980s, both imprisonment and violent crime increased. And from the 1990s to present, violent crime fell precipitously while incarceration rates continued to skyrocket. So the upshot here is that violent crime has fluctuated pretty dramatically, independent of the political response in the levels of incarceration. However, these national trends also tend to mask as much as they reveal. And like juvenile gun deaths, homicide risk is also dramatically uneven across race, sex, age, and importantly, geography. So these 2 figures show homicide victimization by race and sex in 1950, 1960, and then from 1970 to 2016. And you can see this among 15 to 24-year-olds on your left and 25 to 44-year-olds on your right, just for comparison. And we can see that white women enjoy relative security from violence. That's that gray trend line on the very bottom, with about a rate of about 3 or 4 per every 100,000 homicides for white women. For reference, that's about on par with Scandinavia, which was one of the safest places in the world. However, black women consistently face greater violent victimization than their white male counterparts. That's that trend line in yellow, despite known gender disparities in violence. And most strikingly, homicide rates for young black men parallel those of some of the most dangerous countries in the world, places like El Salvador, Venezuela, and Honduras. So we can see that homicide deaths for 15 to 24-year-old black men doubled from 1960 to 1970, and then tripled in the 1980s and 1990s. Homicides have also disproportionately affected young black women and girls. They're 500 times higher than they are for their white female counterparts. So here we can see age-adjusted homicide victimization rates by race and ethnicity, and this figure largely corroborates the trends shown above. So homicides have been the leading cause of death for young black women and men aged 15 to 34 since the 1970s. And I wanted to know why. Well, what was it that exposed young black men and women to these unparalleled rates of violent victimization? So to answer this question, I focused on Chicago. So just for a bit of background, I grew up just outside Chicago in the northern suburb of Evanston. And I also spent my research sabbatical year a few years ago, pre-pandemic, as a visiting professor at the University of Chicago. And when I was there, I stayed in this neighborhood of Hyde Park. So Hyde Park is home to the University of Chicago. It is an affluent white neighborhood on the south side of the city, surrounded by other neighborhoods that are overwhelmingly poor and black. And Chicago is in many ways a city that is steeped in paradox. It's one of the most diverse cities in the country in terms of its racial and ethnic composition, but it's also the most segregated city in America in terms of integration at the neighborhood level. And you can actually visualize that in this map over here. So this map shows each dot represents one person across different racial and ethnic categories. And you can actually visually see the level of both racial diversity and racial separation. Now, despite a lot of negative political and media attention, Chicago is not the most violent city in America. It's not even usually even in the top 20. However, Chicago homicides do generally mirror national trends. You see that same spike in the 1970s, violence is disproportionately high till the 1990s, then you see it drop off and peak again in 2016 and in 2020. Chicago experienced 658 homicides in 2017, which is up from earlier in the decade, but down pretty considerably from the previous year. And 2017 is significant because that's the year that then President Trump threatened to send in the feds if Chicago doesn't, quote, fix the horrible carnage. Now, Trump's rhetoric portrays Chicago with images of a war zone. But you can see in this map that there are many areas in the city that face few or no killings, right? All of these areas on the north side, these lakefront districts, and in the downtown loop. Rather, violence is racially and spatially concentrated on the south and west. Right? These are communities that have been subject to decades of abuse and neglect. And in my research, I found that in a typical year, more than 50% of the homicides are typically clustered in only 3 or 4 communities. Usually 80% or more of the victims are Black. And even in the most at-risk communities, I found that only a tiny percentage of the population is at really serious risk of either victimization or offending. Now, since the pandemic, homicides are rising fastest, not in large cities like Chicago, but in smaller cities and even in rural areas. So places like Jacksonville, Florida, and Tulsa, Oklahoma. And I'm going to return back to that point at the end of the talk. So how can we explain these trends? Well, in the 1990s, at the peak of the homicide wave, a political scientist, John DiIulio, warned of a demographic surge of criminally minded youth that he called the coming of the super predators, right? Some of you might remember that rhetoric. Now, DiIulio's theory predicted this demographically unstoppable wave of young people with essentially no conscience and no morals. And his theory ignited, or maybe in some ways reflected, a moral panic surrounding pathologically violent individuals rooted in deviant family structures and corrupt cultures. However, social scientists who study violence tend to reject biological and cultural explanations, and instead they emphasize the importance of place. So things like the level of racial segregation, isolation, poverty, concentrated disadvantage. The legendary sociologist Robert Sampson has studied crime and violence in Chicago, and he argues that it's really our neighborhoods, right, our immediate environment and our immediate surroundings that influences everything from crime, violence, health, civic engagement to things like housing foreclosures and even individual characteristics like leadership or altruism. Now, this New York Times map largely corroborates Sampson's theory. So this shows the communities in Chicago with the highest level of poverty juxtaposed with childhood gun deaths in 2020. And not surprisingly, the killings tend to be concentrated in the most impoverished communities. Yet, structural inequalities, things like racial segregation and poverty, are not new historically. And if you look back historically, violence and victimization was never an inevitable result. In fact, in the early to mid-1900s, 95% of Chicago's Black population lived in this really small sliver of land that was colloquially referred to as the Black Belt. These residents faced inadequate housing, overcrowding, health disparities, just a range of inequalities. But communities were intact and violence was relatively low. So, in light of all this, I provide an alternative explanation. And I argue that street violence is rooted in these broader patterns of violent state interventions. And specifically, in the post-World War II decades, the 1940s through the 1970s, lawmakers fortified suburbs and lured wealth and investment to cities with things like racially exclusionary housing laws and land clearance programs. Now, I found that these policies destabilized many vibrant Black cultural hubs, tight-knit immigrant communities, and multi-ethnic neighborhoods decades prior to the prison boom. These programs demolished homes, businesses, community infrastructure. They forcibly displaced people who lived there, and they created these isolated spaces, cut off from resources, investment, and opportunity. Meanwhile, I found that these episodes of state violence also fueled just a range of responses, everything from political mobilization, armed resistance, and rebellion to these increasing levels of street violence. And I'm going to talk about each of these responses in turn, but first I want to really focus on this idea of state violence. What do I mean by state violence? I argue that state violence manifests not only through instantaneous, very public violence, like policing and incarceration, but also through the physical architecture of built communities. So this includes government programs that differentially expose people to increase injury, harm, or premature death. So I focus on exclusionary housing laws that expanded affordable homeownership for white people while moving people of color into the least desirable areas, exposing them to overcrowding, substandard housing, and foreclosing investment options. So this includes things like redlining grades and predatory lending arrangements. At the same time, land clearance programs disproportionately tore through Black and ethnic neighborhoods. They demolished homes, businesses, and local infrastructure. This includes things like freeway construction, urban renewal projects, and public housing developments. And finally, I found that when Black Americans migrated to other neighborhoods, either to escape overcrowding or as a result of forced displacement, they invariably faced intimidation and terrorism from white gangs and white mobs. And Chicago police often tolerated and sometimes even endorsed the violence. So I look at locations where white gangs held territories. I look at instances of white violence organized against integration, and I look at police misconduct allegations. And I argue that these structural forms of violence affect citizens' everyday lives, and they increase their level of vulnerability and insecurity. So I spent a year in Chicago visiting at the University of Chicago, but accessing archives all over the city and compiling new databases and cataloging and mapping state violence and community resistance across Chicago communities from 1940 to 1979, and then from 2000 to 2015. And I'm going to show you just a few examples. So I'm going to start with redlining, which is a concept that some of you may be familiar with. So from 1939 to 1940, the Homeowners Loan Corporation, which was part of FDR's New Deal government, rated the investment value of neighborhoods to indicate who should receive loans and which neighborhoods were safe investments. The problem was that race was commonly used as a proxy for bad risk. So many mixed race neighborhoods were automatically labeled as hazardous, and they were denied federally backed mortgages, regardless of the income or the credit history of the buyer. So this automatically lowered property values in these neighborhoods, and it paralyzed investment opportunities. So the places that are colored in this like deep dark red, this maroon on the map, indicate that all of the residential spaces in that designated community area received the lowest D grade and were colored in red on the maps. And this image, just to the right, shows communities with the lowest D grade overlaid on the percent of the Black population in the city. Right? So you can see that redlining pervaded Chicago's city center, saturating the South Side Black Belt, but also affecting many adjacent white working class and ethnic communities, as well as these communities down here on the far southeast side. So this meant that ethnically diverse hubs at the heart of Chicago's downtown city center were redlined and left to deteriorate, while many white communities on the periphery of the city and in the outlying suburbs received things like preferential lending terms, housing subsidies, and all sorts of commercial investments. So these redlining practices locked most people of color out of normal mortgage markets, which meant the ability to take out a loan with very low money down, with low interest payments, the ability to pay the mortgage back over a long period of time, that 30-year window, and most importantly, the ability to acquire equity on a home before the mortgage was fully paid off. However, Black Americans still bought property. And since they were unable to access traditional federal mortgages, they were forced to turn to these unregulated contract sales. These were predatory agreements that were designed to produce failure and just to extract wealth from the buyer. And scholars like Kianga Yamada Taylor and Beryl Satter have these masterful studies that detail these exploitative real estate practices. And more recent studies have found that these lending schemes rob Black families in Chicago of billions of dollars. So next, I'm going to look briefly at freeway construction in Chicago. So this figure displays highway construction in the 1950s and 1960s, overlaid on the percent of the city's Black population in 1940, 1950, and 1960. So you can see the Eisenhower Expressway runs east to west. It severed the city's west side immigrant communities. And the Dan Ryan runs north to south, and it tore through Chicago's historic Black Belt. Now, collectively, construction to build these freeways connecting the city to adjacent suburbs destroyed more than 50,000 homes, destroyed hundreds of businesses. They tore through parks and other recreation centers and just replaced them with miles of blight and noise pollution. And you can see in these maps that nearly all of the communities that were leveled by highways became predominantly Black enclaves by the 1960s. I also found that public housing was initially built in white spaces for white families when the program originated in the 1930s, and the city built segregated spaces for Black families the following decade. However, after 1950, all the city's new projects were exclusively located in either majority Black or racially transitioning communities. And this meant that the CHA, the Chicago Housing Authority, demolished a lot of desperately needed family homes and physically concentrated poor and low-income Black residents in what became chronically underfunded and politically neglected spaces. And I'll show you just one example in context. This is an image of Bronzeville in 1935. Bronzeville was a vibrant Black neighborhood with family homes and local businesses. However, the Chicago Housing Authority demolished large swaths of the neighborhood to make way first for the Ida B. Wells homes in the 1940s, and then the Stateway Gardens and the Robert Taylor homes the following decade. So this is an image of the Robert Taylor homes, which was actually built to contain poor and low-income Black residents who were forcibly displaced from construction to build the Dan Ryan, which we saw on that previous slide. Now, many of the city's public housing projects, including the Ida B. Wells homes, were initially very successful, but they were subject to neglect and they were chronically underfunded. Residents battled rodents, all sorts of infestations, mold, exposed wire, lack of heat, lack of hot water, producing what one scholar characterized as a system that, she says, and I'm quoting, incubated misery and divestment. So this is an image of the same intersection in 2020. And you can see that what was once a vibrant neighborhood was replaced with a vacant lot when the city demolished the public housing projects as part of a broader gentrification strategy. So in the first part of the project, I examined the racial geography of state violence and its effects in specific communities. In the second part of the project, I examined how communities responded to programs like these that threaten their homes, their lives, and their livelihoods. And I found that political mobilization was pervasive. And this extends well beyond the context of the civil rights movement, which is probably the examples that most of us are the most familiar with. This scholar, Elizabeth Hinton, is a historian at Yale, and she documented hundreds of uprisings in cities and even small towns in the late 1960s and 1970s. And Hinton referred to these uprisings as Black rebellions, and she used that term very deliberately. She's arguing against some of the conventional wisdom that these weren't riots or looting or irrational violence. These were protests in response to things like unfair living conditions, entrenched inequality, police brutality, and just a lack of opportunity. However, police often showed up to these uprisings in things like riot gear. They used weapons like batons, rubber bullets, and tear gas. And protesters often responded to police violence with violence, resulting in widespread property destruction, injuries, and even deaths. So this is an image of a student rebellion, an uprising in Delaware in 1969, although in many ways it looks more like a celebration, I think, than an insurgency. This is an image of Washington, D.C. in 1968 after Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated. You can see that large swaths of the city or the district were literally on fire as protesters responded with anguish and rage. And this is a more recent example from Minneapolis in 2020 after the police killing of George Floyd. And it's important to note, I think, that Black Lives Matter protests are not quite the same thing as Black rebellions. For one thing, Black Lives Matter protests are multiracial. And secondly, the vast majority of them were peaceful protests, although there was some property destruction and there was some counter-violence. So in my project, I seek to build on Hinton's framework. And to do this, I accessed all sorts of community archives throughout the city and historically Black-owned newspapers. And I uncovered evidence of these really diverse forms of resistance, which are not always understood or immediately viewed as political. And scholars tend to refer to this as everyday forms of resistance. Again, I found hundreds of examples. I'm just going to highlight a few. So first, and maybe most commonly, I found that Black women in housing projects constantly organized and lobbied for more and better protection. They did things like keep records of elevator service issues. They identified different code violations in the building. Some of them even filed lawsuits. So one community organizer said, "You are entitled to have regular heat and hot water, to have safe elevators, to not be afraid of rodents. We had a lot of hard work to do." So this person is actually employing the language of rights as an organizing tool. So these women in housing projects constantly exchanged services with each other, things like cooking and daycare. And they formed these systems for mutual cooperation and mutual support. And the Chicago Defender, a historically Black-owned newspaper in Chicago, reported when 10 families in the Cabrini Green housing project, was a pretty notorious project on the north side of the city, came together and washed, scrubbed, and painted the housing project, and hundreds of families and residents joined in the effort. The Chicago Defender also reported about how parents and teens in the Robert Taylor homes met to organize against crime in the projects. They advocated for a better, more accountable law enforcement and for all sorts of social service provisions. Action for Survival was a really broad social movement, and they held workshops informing community members about their legal rights. Communities also held what they called mutual survival programs. They were workshops teaching resident survival tactics in the case of civil disorder. Now, at the same time, I also found that Black youth and young adults began to form these armed groups for collective protection. And when these groups originated in the 1950s, they were really best described as sort of a motley collection of poor youth that were threatened by white gangs and denied conventional forms of opportunity. However, they expanded and they institutionalized in subsequent decades, and they were subsequently labeled as gangs. Now, this term gang sometimes evokes images of something like the mafia, right? An organization that's highly organized, centralized, and engaged in these criminal enterprises. However, many Black youth gangs were, and actually still are, very disorganized and decentralized. They were not uniformly or essentially violent or criminal entities. A lot of people joined for a sense of physical safety and out of a sense of community and belonging. I found that these organizations were largely dismissed by people in power for more than a decade, and they were formally denounced as gangs after they formed alliances with civil rights and Black power movements in their neighborhoods. So groups like the Blackstone Rangers, who you see to your left, the Vice Lords, who you see to your right, and the Gangster Disciples, who are not pictured here, all did use violence to capture informal economies from white crime syndicates in their communities and to control territories. And some individual members did commit violent actions. either for survival or status or opportunity. However, I found that their functions were constantly shifting and were really multifaceted. In Chicago's most influential black gangs, the Lordstones and Disciples, sometimes dubbed LSD, all formed alliances with community organizations, clergy, and activists in the 1960s, even while they were expanding their illicit operations into illicit economies. So this is an image of Bobby Gore, who was the leader of the Vice Lords in the 1950s and 1960s. And Gore was eulogized in the Chicago Tribune in 2013. And Chicago Tribune is a relatively conservative paper. Now, Gore spent some time in prison on a murder charge, but he was also an activist and he was a community organizer. This is an image of Jeff Thorpe, who is the leader of the Blackstone Rangers. Thorpe was also a community activist, and he worked very closely with the Woodlawn organization in his community. Now, these groups provided social welfare functions for their communities, things like money, resources, and recreation for black youth. For instance, the Vice Lords opened a recreation center in Lawndale called the House of Lords. They held cookouts, they offered scholarship opportunities for black youth in their communities to go to college, and they started local businesses in Lawndale. The Blackstone Rangers served as parade marshals when Martin Luther King Jr. came to Chicago to protest against unfair housing. The Rangers committed to King's principles of nonviolence, and they protected King and the protesters from rocks, bottles, and bricks that were hurled by hostile white residents. They also helped keep the peace on the South Side after Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated. The Gangster Disciples, led by Larry Hoover, administered free breakfast programs to feed hungry children and provided all sorts of community functions in their community in Englewood. Now, in the late 1960s, these groups all allied with Chicago's Black Panther Party. And the Black Panther Party was led by Fred Hampton in Chicago. They formed for armed self-defense. So in the late 1960s, Hampton organized what he called a multi-racial rainbow coalition, which unified the Panthers with a Puerto Rican gang, a poor white gang, and a white middle-class movement. They were all led by organizers and students in communities that were threatened by urban renewal. And this is an image of members of the Rainbow Coalition marching together in a protest in Chicago. So Hampton, the leader of the Black Panther Party, negotiated a truce between the Lordstones and Disciples, culminating in the 1969 United Front. And collectively, these groups all administered local survival programs in their communities rooted in mutual aid traditions, including things like free breakfast, free health clinic, free daycare, free busing to prisons, and free clothing. So this is an image of Fred Hampton speaking to children at Chicago's free breakfast program. This is an image of the first patient that was treated at a free clinic that opened in Chicago. Here's an image of two women involved in the free food program, members of the Vice Lords organizing members of the community to clean up the neighborhood in North Lawndale. And here are the Vice Lords after they opened Teen Town, which was a recreation center for youth, with money that they procured from a government grant. Now, these programs were so successful in marshaling public support that the FBI director, J. Edgar Hoover, wrote a memo in 1969 warning FBI offices that they needed to take them out. And he said, the Breakfast for Children program represents the best and most influential activity going for the Black Panther Party, and as such is potentially the greatest threat to efforts by authorities to neutralize the BPP and destroy what it stands for. Now, declassified documents reveal that it wasn't only the FBI that tried to sabotage the Panthers, it was also the local Chicago police who attempted to sabotage the program by breaking into the sponsoring church the night before the breakfast program was slated to open and urinating on all the food. Meanwhile, Mayor Richard J. Daley in Chicago empowered a gang intelligence unit in 1967 that was designed to disrupt groups involved in civil rights organizing. The Chicago Defender, Chicago's historically black-owned paper, criticized the GIU as an attempt to deliberately limit black self-determination and deliberately stoke animosity and tension in black communities. So the gang intelligence unit relied on all types of different types of subversion. So things like informants, undercover operations, disinformation, and they did this to infiltrate organizations and to stoke rivalries. So the GIU raided and surveilled both the Blackstone Rangers and the Gangster Disciples headquarters. They deliberately incited violence to harm the group's credibility. They worked with the FBI when the Bureau sent Jeff Thorpe, the Blackstone Rangers leader, a letter warning him that the Panthers, quote, put a hit out for you, hoping that the threat would catalyze retaliatory action. The GIU also notoriously rounded up and dumped members in enemy territory. They carried out beatings, torture, and even murder in these so-called black sites, which were locations that were essentially off the grid, where suspects were held indefinitely and interrogated, and due process rights were essentially suspended indefinitely. And Spencer Ackerman actually broke that story for The Guardian in 2015. In 1969, the Afro-American Patrolmen's League, which was an organization of black police officers in Chicago, charged that police department actions in black communities amounted to what they referred to as genocide. And the Daily biographer, Mike Royko, captured the political threat that motivated this crackdown. He said, blacks had been killing each other for years without inspiring any great concern in City Hall. But these young toughs could be dictating who their alderman would be if he didn't stop them. They had set up a free food program in the ghetto, and it opened up a health clinic that was superior to those of Daley's own health department. So these counter-subversion tactics culminated in the raid and assassination of Fred Hampton in 1969 when he was asleep at his apartment in Chicago, and the incarceration of gang leaders like Bobby Gore and Jeff Thorpe. And these are all images either during or after the raid, courtesy of archives at the Chicago History Museum. Now, these counterinsurgency tactics depoliticized youth gangs, but it didn't eliminate them. Instead, the Gangster Disciples emerged as the direct inheritors of the Black Panther Party's organizing structure and their militant ideologies. They still had the same easy access to guns, but now devoid of the ideological principles that animated the Panthers in these Black liberation movements. So as members grew disillusioned with political change, they redirected their energy toward more tangible goals, things like profiteering and territorial control. And one Vice Lords member was quoted saying, once Vice Lords leader Bobby Gore went down, guys didn't have jobs, and there was money to be made selling drugs. Right? So political fatalism, crippling distrust, violent factionalism, all these things undermine these groups' community-oriented and social functions. And they fueled increasing controversy and violent turf wars. So it's in this specific context that Chicago homicides doubled from the 1960s to the mid-1970s. And the violence was concentrated in places like Englewood, which is home to the Gangster Disciples, Woodlawn, home to the Blackstone Rangers. This is North Lawndale, home to the Vice Lords. And this is Grand Boulevard and the near West Side, which are communities where gangs held territories in the city's public housing projects. So in 1969, the Chicago Defender quoted a Rangers member who recriminated Daley's plan to crush the city's youth gangs as a deliberate attempt to refuse to address divestment and insecurity in Black communities, and not a reaction to, but a cause of the increasing level of street violence. So this Rangers member reflected on the oppression, violence, lack of opportunity that characterized everyday life for Black youth. And I'm going to quote this passage at length. What Daley lacks is honesty, the youth said. The ghetto is a jungle, and in a jungle, the only important thing is survival. Opportunity is non-existent for the average teenager there, and because of it, he lacks respect for society. How can you expect a young man to lead a constructive life when his world is filled with poverty, bigotry, and destruction? So this young person denounced Daley's refusal to invest in black youth and subsequent over-reliance on these mechanisms of violent social control. Daley has said on a number of occasions that he is sincerely interested in today's youth. So what does he do for the black youth? He forms a gang intelligence unit, which serves as an instrument to perpetuate violence. The youth who preferred to remain anonymous told the Daily Defender that Daley had failed by not providing, quote, emotional and economic incentives for black youth, which may have altered the present wave of violence. So I think that this reflection is both poignant and prescient. And the evidence suggests that gangs didn't just emerge randomly, and when they did, street violence was not inevitable. Both gangs and street violence occurred as a response to state violence and repression. And I'm going to provide just a few examples illustrating state violence and homicide trends in context. So I'm going to go back to the example from above. This is the community area of Grand Boulevard in the neighborhood of Bronzeville. This is an image of Bronzeville in the 1930s. Bronzeville was celebrated as a black metropolis. It contained vibrant shopping areas, theaters, world-class music venues, family homes, and thriving businesses. However, as we saw before, the city razed large swaths of the neighborhood and replaced these homes and businesses with a 4-mile corridor of concrete slab structures occupied exclusively by poor black residents, while the Dan Ryan Expressway essentially served as a racial barrier separating the Black Belt from neighboring Irish Bridgeport. Now, in the 1970s, after the city's gang crackdown, violence increased and overwhelmed the project and terrorized residents. I'm also going to tell you a little bit about this adjacent community of Englewood. Now, Englewood was historically an immigrant community. This is an image of Englewood in 1955. And black in-migration to Englewood began in the 1940s as residents left the Black Belt to escape overcrowding, in large part because Englewood was both affordable and accessible. And it accelerated pretty considerably in the 1950s when residents were forcibly displaced. Now, Englewood was historically redlined, which meant that incoming black residents were locked out of normal mortgage markets. They faced things like predatory installment contracts, which fueled just hideous levels of overcrowding. Black pupils were warehoused in trailers instead of brick and mortar school buildings. And because of overcrowding, they were sent to schools in half days, in shifts. And meanwhile, they confronted violent white gangs and white mobs. So the Devil's Disciples formed in Englewood in the early 1950s for protection and retaliation. They later became the Gangster Disciples. In the 1960s, white majorities fled, and the neighborhood became majority black. And in the 1970s, violence escalated as the Gangster Disciples and Blackstone Rangers abandoned their truce, and street violence escalated to more than 50 murders in a single year. Now, Englewood currently has 5% of the city's population, and in an average year, about 25% of the murders. The community has continued to suffer from decades of divestment, as you can see in this image of a boarded up building that was taken in 2012. And finally, I'm going to tell you a little bit about Austin, which is this community on the far west side. Now, in the 1940s, Austin was 99% white, and a majority of residents were foreign-born. This is an image of Sangamon and Congress Street in 1939. It was a vibrant commercial hub. This is that same intersection in 1951, and it became an excavation pit. And that's because the site was targeted to build the Eisenhower Expressway. However, while buildings were cleared in 1948, the construction wasn't actually complete until 1961. And in the meantime, you have 13,000 residents that were displaced, hundreds of businesses were gone, buildings were abandoned, and neighborhoods were demolished. So white ethnic residents gradually fled the neighborhood. In the 1970s, the Four Corner hustlers dominated the heroin trade in Austin, and violence escalated. This is the image of Sangamon and Congress Street in 2014. The community is currently 90% black, a majority of residents are below poverty, and it is still besieged by violence and insecurity. All right, so these are all historical examples. What does this mean today? Well, I want to suggest, against conventional wisdom, that it's not simply segregation and poverty that trigger violence. It's the destruction of community infrastructure, the loss of formal economies, the erosion of social bonds, pervasive distrust in police and other institutions that are meant to keep people safe. This is what sociologists refer to as collective efficacy. Now, in post-war Chicago, state violence and repression eroded conventional foundations for what's often referred to as social capital. Social capital are those invisible bonds that create a sort of trust and reciprocity between neighbors. And research shows that social capital has a huge range of benefits. So it makes systems like mutual aid and collective action possible. Being able to rely on your neighbors creates a sense of belonging and security. Research has found that social capital is commonly found in friendship networks and community organizations, which conventionally includes things like churches, schools, recreation centers, civic association, and barbershops. But I also found that it's also located in less conventional places, things like public housing projects, street corners, and bars. Now, in Chicago, these violent state interventions not only demolished conventional infrastructure that promotes social capital, but also deliberately sowed distrust and isolation in Black communities. And the point I want to emphasize here is that social capital is integral to the health and well-being of communities everywhere of all races. Right? A sense of social cohesion is really important for safety and security everywhere. In 2000, the political scientist Robert Putnam did this huge study and found that more Americans than ever are bowling, but they're not bowling in leagues, they're bowling alone. And more broadly, this meant that we belong to fewer organizations, we know our neighbors less, and we socialize less frequently. And Putnam viewed this as a really alarming indicator of declining social capital. And I'm going to circle back to this at the end of the talk. So I think it's helpful to think about violence as a social crisis that clusters with other symptoms of social deprivation. So these are structures that lock people out of things like schooling and meaningful jobs, and just the ability to keep up with the escalating costs of modern life, as well as the sense of personal and psychological security and well-being. Now, the trauma surgeon, Dr. Victor Garcia, emphasizes that young people facing structural violence, so things like redlining, concentrated poverty, hypersurveillance, loss of a family member, either through incarceration or a homicide, and generational trauma, are more likely to do things like carry guns, join gangs, and increase risk-taking later in life. Now, he explains that chronic exposure to violence fundamentally alters the chemical structure of the brain. It increases cortisol, it promotes that fight or flight response, while, and I'm quoting, impairing executive function, that part of the brain that helps you to weigh options and make the right decision. So it's important to emphasize that most people carry guns not because they want to go out and commit a crime, but because they feel unsafe. And when people lack coping mechanisms to manage emotions like anger and fear, minor conflicts can really quickly escalate into these deadly confrontations. Now, a recent study reveals that exposure to violence and hypersurveillance increases hypervigilance and traumatic stress in Black men. Now, these are psychological impairments that are associated with things like anger and irritability and isolation and other risk factors for violence. So the upshot here is that these environmental factors, which are completely outside of a young person's control, produce these vicious self-reinforcing cycles of violence and death. Now, in the book, I drew on my database cataloging state violence, resistance, armed gangs, and homicides spanning 40 plus years. And I use different modeling strategies, including time series and spatial regressions, to examine whether the communities that were targeted by state violence were more likely to produce armed groups and homicides in the following decades, controlling for things like racial demographics and poverty and other things that you would expect to be associated with violence. And my data analysis largely corroborates the case studies that I showed you earlier, right? So state violence, I found, fuels a lot of political mobilization, but it also fuels conditions for armed resistance and street violence. And I found that this is the case systematically, both across communities and over time. And I'm going to show you just a snapshot of my findings without getting into too many of the technical details. So this figure shows predicted probabilities and expected differences drawn from different modeling techniques. So these are all the modeling techniques. And the important thing to note is that the results are really consistent across different model specifications. So this figure shows that communities that were severed by highways in the 1950s and 1960s were about 21 to 37% more likely to produce armed groups in the following decade than other similarly situated communities that did not experience any highway construction. And these communities also incurred about an average of 2 to 7 additional homicides per year. Now, it's notable that these are larger effect sizes than other episodes of state violence that I examined, so things like redlining, urban renewal, and public housing. And I think that this is because, unlike urban renewal, which is meant to essentially gentrify a community, highways just create dead zones, right? This is what economists refer to as negative externalities. You get reduced property values, business closures, abandoned buildings, and vacancies. These all become defensible spaces for illegal activities. So public housing yields similar findings, although slightly more muted. So this shows that a community that received just one additional public housing development was about 7 to 13% more likely to produce armed groups the following decade, and they incurred 1 to 2 additional homicides. So I found that armed groups transformed systems of enforced confinement, so first public housing projects and then later prisons, into resources for things like organizing and agency and self-respect. But from the 1970s onwards, violence largely consumed the city's housing projects as street gangs increasingly withdrew from politics, they abandoned their truce, and they battled each other for status and territory. Now, perversely, this entrenched even more harm and more violence in the most marginalized and vulnerable communities. And I found that this legacy still persists today. So in the 1990s and 2000s, the city demolished public housing projects as part of a broader gentrification strategy. And the second Mayor Daley, son of Richard J. Daley, shifted funding from the city's housing budget into law enforcement and prioritized gang suppression tactics like stop and frisks and mass arrests. So this map shows the number of police misconduct allegations from 2000 to 2016 overlaid on the percent of the Black population. And perhaps not surprisingly, police misconduct claims are disproportionately high in Black communities on the South and West. There are actually 4 communities that where citizens logged more than 5,000 complaints, which over 16 years is about 1 per day. And this is a map of Chicago's homicides in 2020. So violence not only increased relative to the previous year, but it also shifted. Right? So economic developments and policing strategies effectively insulated these lakefront districts, this historic Black belt, but it didn't eliminate the violence, it shifted it further south and further west. And there were several communities that incurred anywhere from 50 to 75 murders in that single year. All right, so what now? I'm going to leave you with just a few takeaways. And the first thing that I want to note is that violence increased during the pandemic. Now, in some sense, that shouldn't be too surprising, right? Because it reflects this acute erosion of social capital. We experienced all sorts of disruptions to everyday life, including the closure of schools and churches and town gatherings, and more people exposed to increased illness and death. And we know that violence escalates when people are alienated from society, from government, and from other citizens. But it's also worth noting that the COVID pandemic also coincided with the police killing of George Floyd and the January 6th insurrection, which further damaged social cohesion and trust in social and political institutions. And it also led to an increasing decline in empathy for our fellow citizens. And in this context, people are more willing to do things like violate rules and norms and to act violently. So the second point I want to emphasize is that homicide rates are now rising fastest, not in big cities like Chicago, but in small towns and rural areas. And the recent increase in murder rates have often been weaponized by media and a lot of right-wing provocateurs as a distinctively Democratic and big city problem. However, 8 of the 10 states with the highest murder rate in 2020 voted for the Republican presidential nominee in every election in the 21st century. So this indicates that violence is not only a problem in big cities like Chicago or Baltimore or Philadelphia. It's also a problem in Jacksonville, Florida, which has one of the highest murder rates in the country, along with Tulsa, Oklahoma. The murder rate in Bakersfield, California, which is home to Senate Majority Leader Kevin McCarthy, is 2 times higher than San Francisco or LA or New York City. And in 2020, the Wall Street Journal reported an alarming increase in homicide rates in rural America. Now, police-community relations are typically less fraught in rural areas than in big cities. However, rural communities did experience a very real breakdown in social connections, right? During the pandemic, as I mentioned earlier, church services and town gatherings halted. People experienced more psychological and financial stress due to isolation and job loss. And in this context, fights between relatives, acquaintances, and even strangers escalated into lethal conflicts a lot more frequently. The Arkansas prosecuting attorney in White County responded to this violence by remarking, "It was like people lost their ever-loving minds." Right? So the point here is that violence is not exclusively or even primarily an urban or a democratic problem. All right, so what can we do? I'm gonna leave you with 2 potential solutions, or at least steps in the right direction. And the first one is to invest in strong communities that keep people safe, right? The communities most affected by violence in Chicago have called for social and economic investments as part of a broader violence prevention strategy for at least half a century. And only recently have these views received any mainstream media attention. So this is an image of Philip Goff, who's the CEO for the Center for Policing Equity and a psychology professor at Yale. And he recently wrote a New York Times op-ed calling for things like mental health resources, a crisis response teams, and housing subsidies as part of a broader violence prevention strategy. And I'm going to quote him at length. He says, "If throwing money at police and prisons made us safer, we would probably already be the safest country in the history of the world. We are not, because insufficient punishment is not the root cause of violence. And if people are talking about how scared they are and how scared you should be, they're more concerned about keeping you scared than keeping you safe." This is an image of Franklin Cosi Gay. He published an op-ed in the Chicago Tribune, and he's the director of the Violence Recovery Program at the University of Chicago Medicine. Now, Cosi Gay described the survivors of violence that he's worked with firsthand as the walking wounded. And by that, he's referring not only to their physical injuries, but what he says, and I'm quoting, their spiritual and emotional state, which he says are connected to decades of structural violence. And he also calls for more holistic public policy solutions. He says, "The Violence Recovery Program exists because leaders at our hospital realize that the care needed for survivors of gun violence and their families far exceeds the time we have to treat their physical wounds in an emergency room. The Violence Recovery Program model includes 24/7 violence recovery specialists in the ER, spiritual care, social workers, and child life specialists. Through this multidisciplinary approach, we can establish trusting relationships and connections to outpatient resources in a way that recognizes survivors' trauma and helps them navigate challenges they might face after hospital discharge, from mental health resources to financial assistance." And the last point that I want to leave you with actually moves beyond policy solutions. And here we're actually talking about directly actionable items. And that is to contribute to civil society and community-based organizations that work to strengthen communities. And I want to emphasize that this applies to everybody, no matter where you live. I'm just going to provide 2 examples from Chicago. So MASK is an acronym for Mothers and Men Against Senseless Killing. This group originated in Englewood in 2015 as a response to street violence. Its founder, Tamar Manasseh, is a Black woman, a mother, and a rabbinical student. And Manasseh says, "I'm not an activist. I'm just a mother. I used to think my greatest accomplishment was raising 2 happy, healthy children in Chicago, where so many other mothers are denied that right. Then I sat in a lawn chair on a street corner and extended the love I have for my kids to someone else's. I have been enriched and deeply fulfilled by all of my children. I hope that one day you get to experience the same level of purpose that I have. See you on the block." So the members of this organization occupy spaces on the block to sort of keep eyes on the street and potentially interrupt violence. But as you can see in this image, they also do things like cook meals and play music. They play games with kids and other local residents. They show compassion for each other. They are actually strengthening their community by literally just hanging out. And the final organization that I want to flag is Chicago's anti-eviction campaign, which was founded by Willie Fleming, who goes by JR. And this group works to take over vacant and abandoned houses in Chicago and restore them for unsheltered residents. And Fleming says, if the government won't provide public housing for the people must provide it for themselves. Now, just for context, there were 62,000 vacancies in Chicago following the 2008 and 2009 foreclosure crisis. More than 40% of residents on the South and West Side actually owed more on their homes than their mortgages were worth. And banks were forcing families in foreclosure out of their homes while failing to properly maintain, restore, or market them, even while the city faced a pretty severe affordable housing shortage and a homelessness crisis. So the anti-eviction campaign canvassed neighborhoods with a lot of foreclosed homes and asked local residents if they supported a renovation and takeover of these houses, either for unsheltered residents or for different types of community resources. And I'm going to end with a quote from Fleming. He says, "The government failed us, the market failed us. Harvard, Yale, and the University of Chicago failed us. Our government, the government, doesn't belong to us. Forget them, they forgot us. We need to solve our problems ourselves." So I thank you again for your time, and I welcome your questions and your comments.
So at this time, I'd like to open it up for questions. If you have a, oh yeah, here we go.
Hi, and thank you for being here. I was just wondering if you could provide us a definition of the word violence.
So I use the term state violence to refer to government policies and programs that systematically and differentially expose people to any sort of injury, harm, or premature death. So that definition would certainly include the type of state violence that we immediately come to mind, that include things like police brutality and incarceration, certainly like torture, solitary confinement, but also includes different forms of structural violence that act on bodies, but do so more slowly, more incrementally, and in ways that are less immediately visible.
Thank you.
I have a question, actually. As you were talking about the gangs that would provide social services, my historian brain here, went immediately to Boss Tweed and New York in the late 19th century and the Tammany Hall networks that were incredibly corrupt and sometimes violent and also provided a whole lot of services to people.
Yeah.
So that would be mostly in immigrant communities, so Irish American communities, Italian American communities. Would you say that that's something similar that you see in Chicago in the 1960s and 70s there?
So that the daily, even prior to, there was a series of democratic machines in Chicago that operated on a similar model to Tammany Hall, and they would actually sponsor youth gangs, which were predominantly second-generation immigrant communities, and they would give them things like resources and and they would later provide them with patronage, like jobs in police and fire departments, in exchange for, I mean, everything from, you know, stuffing ballot boxes to, like, you know, getting out the vote in other ways that other ways that some of which were licit and some of which were, you know, like maybe possibly more corrupt. I found that the difference with black youth gangs is that they were never directly sponsored by any, you know, by any political party or, you know, anybody that was empowered politically or by any of the economic elites in the city either. I mean, they basically formed largely as a response to violence from white youth gangs and white mob violence. And then they took it upon themselves to provide resources for their communities that state and other economic elites had largely abandoned.
Okay, thank you very much.
Dr. Thorpe, thanks so much for coming down and spending this night with us. We are not Chicago, we're not Seattle, we're not Evanston. So it's probably not a surprise that I'm really interested in that factoid you shared at the end about how currently homicide rates are growing the fastest in small towns and rural communities, because I see us in that. So I'm just wondering, from the perspective of your research, how you explain that. So much at the beginning of your conversation was talking about these state interventions in, you know, investing in suburbs and gentrification in urban areas. So do you see something similar happening now in rural communities, or do you explain that sort of breakdown in communities differently in this contemporary era that we're in?
Yeah, I mean, I think the one main unifying thread is the decline in social capital. And I think the reasons for that decline are, you know, very wide ranging and potentially multifaceted, right? So in the case of post-war Chicago, it was these violent state interventions and these repressive policing tactics. In other places, I mean, and certainly more recently, I think a lot of it was at least exacerbated by the pandemic, which I mentioned earlier, but not exclusively the pandemic. So, you know, we've seen more attention to police killings, so police-community relations are a lot more fraught. You know, politically, we are much more divided as a country. There's a lot more distrust and animosity for our fellow citizens. I mean, a lot of that has sort of culminated with the January 6th insurrection, but preceded that as well. And I think all of those things compounding create a context where people are more likely to do things like, you know, violate norms and you know, and break rules and you know, and potentially even act violently.
Okay, we have another one.
Yes, I'd like to join others in thanking you so much for your presentation. Violence is very, very disproportionately a male phenomenon. Did you come across, what ideas do you have that would explain that?
Yeah, that's a great question. And so that certainly comports with what I've uncovered just empirically. That the perpetrators are disproportionately male. I don't really study the gender dimensions, so I mean, I would be speculating. I guess I'm not. I don't feel as though I'm have the expertise to provide a really what you might consider a really satisfying or conclusive answer on that question. I think part of it might have to do just with you know, cultural norms and the way that we sort of conceptualize masculine versus feminine characteristics. So masculine characteristics tend to be, you know, more aggressive, tend to promote violence more than, you know, the way that we conceptualize more feminine characteristics. There might also be a biological component, since, on average, testosterone is generally higher in males than it is in females. And this might also, correlate with, the age demographics as well. It's disproportionately young men rather than, like very small children or much older males. So there's this idea of even sort of like aging out of, of violence, or what we consider to be a demographic that is potentially at risk of violence.
Okay, well, I want to take this opportunity now also to thank Dr. Thorpe and to welcome everybody to, we have coffee and cookies outside, so if you would like to hang out for a little bit and have a snack and chat, that would be lovely. And then I will tell you to have a wonderful evening and come back to more events at the college. This is building our community right here. Thank you.